Okay, I'm back for part 2 of this reaction because there's so much to it, and I was interrupted a lot during part 1. So here we are with part 2. All right.
Non-Christians have an absolute ontological dignity. This makes labor infinitely more valuable than profit. It makes humanity more valuable than technologies which just run on the logic of productivity and efficiency. And unlike the tendency of a lot of American evangelical Christians to associate morality and justice with purely individual behaviors, my man Charlie Kirk would always talk about stuff like this. Rest in peace, big dog. Leo reminds us that social justice is a structural issue and that the logic of tech, militarism, and capitalism are dehumanizing us at a structural level. It's kind of, it's not Marxist. It's not like explicitly Marxist, but it's in conversation with that tradition, is all I would say.
See, I would say it's not even in conversation with that tradition at all. I would say it is something that is developed totally independently of that tradition. Right. And it's derived logically, completely independently from that tradition altogether. Right. It comes to the problem of, again, as I said before, reading yourself into the document versus reading the document on its own terms from its own frameworks. But it's easier to read famous documents and popular things within our own framework, within our own political polemics, because it requires us to know about the other. Right? I don't know how familiar Michael Burns is with Catholic social teaching at all. But regardless of what he knows or doesn't know about it, he's certainly not reading Magnifica Humanitas in light of Catholic social teaching. He's reading it in light of leftist polemics. I'm not saying that that's totally contrary to the document. It's clearly not. They're coming to a lot of the same conclusions. And they're coming to those conclusions independently of each other. But shrinking everything down and hammering it into the whole West left-right divide thing is childish. It's a fundamentally childish thing. It reduces our intellectual ability to deal with others who believe different things and pretends and locks them into our own little club. And that's not the point of this document. The point of this document is to get to those who otherwise... A point that this commentary misses on this document is that this is a warning to people who engage in the behaviors it warns about, to draw them away from that activity. And the people who I think need to read this the most are very apt to not listen to your critique of them if you frame that critique in Marxian language. Right? The right, who at least in the United States is guilty of the things that Pope Leo criticizes, right, is not apt to listen to that criticism if it is wrapped in Marxian terms. If it comes from or has anything to do with Marxian terms, because they associate all of those things with all of the crimes against humanity that communist and socialist regimes have perpetrated. So even if they say something correct and true, it's going to fall on deaf ears to the people who need to hear it. Whereas, if you read the document from the context it is written in, from the framework in which it is written in, that is Catholic social teaching, then the people who need to hear the document the most might actually hear it. But if we force it into a leftist lens, even if there are a lot of similarity there, then it drives away, in my opinion, the people who need to hear it the most. It also equates things that aren't equal. Right? Marxian materialism is not Catholic social teaching. The only reason they have any similarity is because they're dealing with the same subject, that is, human beings and the environment around them. They have very different objectives in mind. The goal of all Catholic teaching, whether it's social teaching or otherwise, is to unite souls to Christ and bring them to heaven. Whereas a leftist materialist paradigm for how a society should be run is focused on material prosperity and material wealth. Now, they have some things in common, namely the common good, solidarity, and an understanding of human dignity. But that doesn't mean their end, what they're trying to achieve, is the same thing. And so to conflate the two, despite any big or small similarities, is a big mistake. Right? It creates a faulty understanding of what the Catholic Church's actual goal is. Right? Material prosperity is fine, but it's not the ultimate goal of human existence.
It's in conversation with the Marxist materialist tradition. Conversation is all I'm saying. And Leo gives us a litmus test for evaluating the...
If Marxism was in conversation, if the Catholic Church was in conversation with any materialist ideology or group, then it would engage with its writings. And Magnifica Humanitas doesn't. So it is not in conversation with any leftist tradition, I would say. Its only referent is Catholic social teaching. Similarity, just because they have some similar points, doesn't mean one isn't the origin of the other, or vice versa. It doesn't mean one is in conversation with the other. What's more likely to be happening is both have independently come to similar conclusions based off of dealing with similar things. I will give you an example. Saint Oscar Romero is a victim of a dictatorship in South America that was propped up by the U.S. government during Cold War polemics because he stood for Catholic social teaching, for human dignity and solidarity. The left-leaning forces in his country, at least on paper, had similar goals and were facing similar problems. So it's likely that they independently came to similar conclusions, especially since the materialist and Marxian tradition, as a prerequisite, has a rejection of religious understanding of reality. Whereas Catholic social teaching, its origin is a religious understanding of reality. Its every expression traces back to that fundamental religious idea that human beings are made in the image and likeness of God. All of Catholic social teaching derives from it. And doesn't derive, and cultural norms, well, maybe cultural changes, norms, or political changes throughout history might create a correlation in the popular mind, but the mind of the populace is not necessarily the mind of the church. And it's not necessarily the mind of Christ. So, there's that to keep in mind. Does it mean that they should be in should or should not be in conversation? That's a different topic. All right, the church is very open to genuine dialogue, and when it does, its references would show it. For example, the Catholic document, I have it over here somewhere. Let me see if I have it up. All right, Catholic docs. All right. For example, what Catholics should know about Muslims. All right, this book, if I can jump to the front real quick. Right, by Sandra Tonis Keating, right, was commissioned by the Catholic Church. It talks about what Catholics and Muslims can learn from each other, and it references, it's a very short book, it's only like 48 pages. But we can see in its references, you can't really see it here, I'll put it on screen later. Right. Various documents that explain Catholic and Islamic teachings. Right? And a glossary. Right? It has resources for further reading. Right? So, when the church is in conversation with something, it's actually in conversation with those ideas and references them accordingly. I'm sorry, there's a little bit of lag on my camera. Oof. This document is not in conversation with leftist thought, or socialist thought, or Marxian thought. If it was, it would say so, and would reference Marx or other socialist thinkers accordingly. It doesn't. All right, back to the reaction.
Reality of social justice today by calling for us to ask how migrants, refugees, and those forced to move due to poverty, violence, and climate change are treated. You know, rather than using GDP or initial IPO offerings as our metrics of societal excess, Leo thinks it'd be wild if we instead looked at the treatment of the most marginalized members of society to see how we're really doing. And to answer that with my favorite Mad Men quote, "Not great, Bob. It's not going great for those people." And because my brain has been so wrecked by the internet, there's a part of the Encyclical that made me think of a moment between the generational thinkers Clavicular and Adam Friedland.
Okay, how could we fix this now?
Have you ever been in love?
That's a tough question. You know, I don't know.
Okay, that's not a tough question. If you have to think about it, the answer is no. If you've ever been in love, you know it. You just know. There's no question about it. It's something so baked into our nature that you just know.
Awesome. It's the ultimate. Honestly, it feels great.
Okay.
But it feels crazy. It feels like you're taking crazy pills sometimes.
Okay,
Love does feel that way because it's forcing us to be unselfish, irrationally unselfish. And that's okay.
stick with me because I'm going to thread this needle. So Leo writes that by today's logic, everything that appears as a limit, incapacity, illness, old age, suffering, vulnerability, tends to be seen primarily as a defect to be corrected rather than as a reality through which our humanity matures and opens itself to relationship. You know, these limits lead to a rational logic by which everything must be maxed and our biological lifespans must be extended because these things offer the sort of ROI that finding love amongst human frailty never would. You know,
Okay. Yeah, he makes an important point. There are two philosophies behind this, transhumanism and posthumanism. They equate human suffering to a problem to be solved, not an opportunity to grow in maturity and relationship. Right? But here's the thing. The only way we grow in maturity and in relationship is through some degree of suffering. When you exercise, you literally rip apart your muscles and build them back up. When you learn, your brain makes new connections and changes. You have to purposely go against the path of least resistance to learn. Right? In Pinocchio, for example, the children's story, there's an island called Pleasure Island. And by indulging in the easy things, you become a slave to those very things. And you become incapable of regulating your behavior like a rational being can. And so, by overindulging and in the pleasures of this life and neglecting a life of virtue, you become incapable of living like anything other than an animal. Right? And so are a slave to the whims of those who aren't. Those who know how to herd the herd. Whoever they might be. And so, we need to accept that suffering is a necessary thing in life and that it is ultimately a helpful thing. Now, does that mean that extreme cases of torture or injury are good or healthy? No, it's not what I mean. I just mean that in order to learn, some degree of suffering is necessary. Right? Some degree of self-discipline, self-regulation, choosing the hard path sometimes is necessary. It doesn't mean that pleasure is bad. But because we are so used to thinking in absolute terms, we miss that nuance. And we miss it to our own detriment. We fail to live up to it at our own detriment. Right?
along that same logic, like why create art? You know, why make music? Why laugh with friends? Why work to better the lives of others or our communities if it contradicts with the logic of pure technological reason? Basically, I'm saying the Pope is Team Friedland and not Team Clavicular. And that's even why the first time I saw that clip in the interview, it really struck me because it's like, this is it. Like, this is the sort of
First off, I have no idea who those two are. I think I'm glad. Well, yeah, I'm just gonna cut that.
Logical effect of the financial logic that's taken over our world. It leads to productivity and self-maximization as the ultimate end goal, and something like finding love with another human as something that's like, whatever. I mean,
You can only disregard love if you've never been in love. Or believe that you've never been loved. But here's the thing. No one would exist if they haven't been loved. Right? In the Soviet Union, there was an experiment where they said, okay, well, what if we just give infants their necessity to survive, but then not have that human connection? And the infants mostly died. Right? That human connection is that love is necessary for us to live. And the more we artificially or accidentally or otherwise lock ourselves away from it, the more it hurts us in the long run, and the harder it becomes to see how it is doing so, how we are hurting ourselves.
it's pretty dehumanizing shit. Also, find love. Love's great. It's hard. It's difficult. You know, it's gonna hurt you. It's gonna hurt you.
Yeah. All right. In order to love, though, you must be unselfish, and that's the source of love's pain. Is that unselfishness is either not reciprocated, or if it is, there's still misunderstandings and there's still problems. Right? And that's okay. Ultimately, what transhumanism and posthumanism ultimately come from is hedonism, the idea that all morality is derived from seeking pleasure and avoiding pain. But that's not where real morality comes from. That's not where real human flourishing comes from. Real human flourishing necessarily entails a certain amount of suffering so that we can actually grow in relationship. And if you cannot accept that fact, then you can never comprehend love. Because love, real love, is to will the good of the other. And sometimes the other will do things that hurt themselves, and so it will hurt you. And vice versa.
It's also worth it. Let's believe in a thing called love. And all of this leads Leo to emphasizing that education is now more important than ever before, especially when the same...
That is an understatement, especially with the rates of illiteracy rising. Right? The more illiterate we become, the more like slaves we become by having an anti-intellectual attitude, especially in the United States. There's a huge anti-intellectual attitude in the United States. It's disgusting. Right? But that attitude creates slaves. We prep ourselves to be slaves to our emotions, our instincts, or to any other thing by having this anti-intellectual attitude. If you are not willing to do the necessary suffering involved with basic learning, then you're not going to be equipped to live life as a free-thinking, rational being. And will spend the rest of your life in subservience of one kind or another, to one thing or person or another. You will never actually be free without some degree of suffering.
Same dudes in charge of the AI revolution want teachers to be replaced by robots that are hooked up to LLMs. Have you guys heard about this? It's a thing already. There's like schools with no teachers that are just AI and they cost a lot of money. And that's a thing already, and people are sending their kids to those schools.
And the illiteracy rates will continue to rise.
Leo argues that against the immediacy and hyperstimulation of digital media and information, real learning involves patience. It needs time for development and engagement with a reality that lies beyond appearances. You know, that journey and slow struggle towards wisdom is the truth that makes us human. And the algorithmic drive towards efficiency and profit is what's threatening our society with large-scale dehumanization. For all the philosophy heads out there, yeah, Leo's getting a little Plato-ish right here, a little platonic romance.
Yeah, no, he's not really getting very platonic. If he was, you'd reference him, but I digress.
I don't like how that feels.
But there are some common philosophical themes that are common to all of the great thinkers, Plato, Aristotle, all the way up to Pope John Paul II, and now Pope Leo today. But this is, again, a similarity, conflating a similarity with a conversation that's may or may not be happening.
Because Leo doesn't want to be associated with the leftist authors that have a last chapter.
Okay, that's a pretty big assumption. That's a really big assumption about the Pope. The Pope did most of his service before he became Pope in Latin America. Served under Pope Francis, was lifted up under Pope Francis, who was largely considered the biggest quote-unquote left-leaning figure in the Catholic world for a long time. So the Pope has no qualms with having conversation with left-leaning thinkers or left-leaning ideas. It's just assuming that the ideas presented in this encyclical are intrinsically unique to left-leaning thought. That's the problem. That's an assumption, and it's not a true one. Because as we saw when we looked at the references, I'll pull them up again. Just a second. Okay, let's... Yeah. None of these sources are intrinsically left-leaning or contain leftist thought. These are all developments of Catholic social teaching. Right? But assuming, and that's it's an assumption being made, that these core principles of Catholic social teaching come from the left. They don't. They're developed independently. Right? In the same way, with two people from two different places working with the same material can come to similar conclusions. But making that assumption is a bad thing. Right? It spoils good faith dialogue because, again, it makes the people who need to hear it the most, the people who are totally unsympathetic to left-leaning ideas of any kind, from actually engaging with the thought. So by neglecting to engage with the document on its own terms, from its own system of thought, and from its own intellectual tradition, and conflating it with your own polemics, causes the people who need to hear this document the most to pass it by. And this was a commonplace throughout the entire pontificate of Pope Francis, for example. Right? Laudato Si. Fratricelli Tu. Sorry, I'm mispronouncing that one. But the document on the environment and blessings of people who struggle with the sin of sodomy. Right? Both of these documents went largely ignored by, in my opinion, the people who needed to read them the most. Because our unwillingness to look at ideas from somewhere else on their own terms. So, this is a big example of someone looking at a document not on its own terms, not through its own framework, but through the reader's framework, not the framework of the actual author of the document. And that's a problem, because it hinders the document's ability to actually be received by people who need it the most. So we need to be willing to make more distinctions. We should not, and we should be adverse to hammering something from some other tradition into our own framework. So, Michael Burns is coming at it from I'm guessing, a leftist materialist perspective. But he's not reading the document from the perspective of Catholic social teaching. And so, not only does he miss it, but somebody on the right who is more curious about this document and comes across this video will assume it is too close to the things that he's already decided weren't worth his time. And so, all parties involved go away not learning anything new, not necessarily learning from each other. Right? So, read things with their own framework in mind. Because if you impose your own polemics onto it, you distort it in a way that is, one, unfaithful to the document, to the text itself, and two, gives the wrong message. It tailors the message in such a way that your opponent will not look at it. All right, let's continue.
Chapter of their book without practical things you can do to respond to the critique. He ends the encyclical with some suggestions.
Okay. The entire document is about these problems that are a natural result of, right, about these problems common in society, and and the entire document is about addressing those problems. So it's natural to end off with some practical steps to solving or avoiding the problems altogether. That's just a natural flow of what the document is trying to accomplish. That's not the Pope running away from engaging with leftist thought, because he's not engaging with leftist thought at all in this text. He's engaging with Catholic social teaching. And proof of that is in the references. All 224 references are references to previous Catholic teaching. It is a gross misinterpretation of the text to assume that the Pope is, I'm playing with leftist ideas over here, but I better hush up on them at the end so that people don't think I'm actually playing with other ideas. Occam's razor applies here. All right? The simplest, most straightforward solution is often the most correct. Is the Pope an institution that maintains its moral tradition, going for now the past 2,026 years, give or take 30, right? Is maintaining that tradition, or it's playing with ideas from people who decide that the church as an institution shouldn't exist, namely Marx, and then picking and choosing what it likes and what it doesn't like it's in some sort of cafeteria. That requires more work and more assumptions than just simply relying on its own traditional teaching on various points of social life. Right? That's the more straightforward reading of this document. That's the one that's actually faithful to the document's references. So if we're going to interpret an encyclical faithfully and accurately, then do so within its actual framework. Let's not impose our own socioeconomic or political frameworks onto it, because it's imposing something that isn't really there. Right? Nothing this encyclical supports, like solidarity, human dignity, right, and the common good, none of these things are intrinsic and unique to leftist thought. Leftists believe these things, but they aren't the only people who do. And a simple survey of human life and history will show you that. I paused this at a really unflattering moment. Well, let's continue.
On how to fight this project of dehumanization. None of these are just go to church, so just in case you're waiting for that part. He doesn't say you have to go to church. So Leo invites us to
Although we should.
disarm words. Now I took this as a call for us to act less insane.
Yes, this. We can disarm words. This is extremely important. I know I read this in the first part, but let's continue. Let's ruminate on the idea some more. Okay, so let's. All right. We must therefore examine our conscience with regard to the words we use, the prejudices we have, and the explicit or implicit aggression that lies within them. Right? This is part of a tradition that goes back to the Desert Fathers, to saints like Thomas Aquinas. Be master of what you say. Right? This goes back to even some of the meditative prayers of the church, or the Psalms, where it says, Lord, place a guard at the door of my mouth. At the gate of my lips, place your protector. It's a prayer asking God, essentially, to prevent me from saying something stupid or aggressive. If everyone who spoke publicly did this for 5 minutes a day, thoroughly thought about what they said that day, and whether or not it was aggressive, or whether or not it was inviting people to the truth, then in a year, most of our geopolitical problems that tend to end in violence probably wouldn't. All right, let's continue.
Online, to stop treating everything we don't like as a critique or an attack on our humanity, and just slow down a bit. Just be like, hey, people are saying stuff, but they're...
Yeah. There is an art to this. This is important advice. This is something everyone needs to sort of imbibe. The art of slowing down, breathing in. Make an obligatory Avatar The Last Airbender reference here. Have some jasmine tea and relax. We've really lost a sense of leisure at a very unique time in our history. Maybe we'll do a video talking about the nature of leisure. That would be good. But different topic, different time. But take a step back. The world won't end the world's not going to end because we used aggressive language. Aggressive language doesn't really get us what we want. as the United States is learning the hard way in its foreign policy and strategic goals. But that's another conversation for another time.
They're people. We're all people. We're trying our best. We're not all trying our best, but let's just not be crazy. He also says that if we want peace in our time, we gotta seek justice for the marginalized. And we can use this as a metric to evaluate systems of power. So whether those are...
This is extremely important. And the fact that we are not taught to do this means that we are systematically not taught to engage in one of our civic duties. Right? We've lost, I believe, collectively, our sense of civic responsibility. Wherever we live, wherever we move, wherever we go, there are certain things we owe each other in a society. And understanding whether or not the place we live actually does live in accordance with the principles of justice or not is extremely important.
Technological systems of power, political systems of power, religious systems of power, we can just ask, are these things leading towards justice for marginalized groups? If not, bye-bye. Along with this, he emphasizes that we need to adopt the perspective of victims, meaning that, for example, when we're reading about the plans for the new Gaza city
or the data center in your hometown
they're going to build, we shouldn't let the metric of success for New Gaza be the business interest of Jared Kushner and friends. Instead, we should evaluate it by the effects that it would have on
of the victims of the genocide there. That's how we should evaluate what's happening there. But I digress.
On those left orphaned by an ongoing genocide. And towards the end, he brings up the importance of dialogue. Now, I know that for many of us that might sound like some sort of soft liberal BS, but I read Leo as emphasizing that we need to treat humans like humans in our dialogue and debate, and not use the logic of media algorithms to trick ourselves into thinking that it's okay for us to engage in the rhetoric and action of dehumanization because we're the good guys.
This is an important point. All right. Immanuel Kant says, all right, use things. Well, I don't know if, but the principle is similar. Love people, use things. Right? Treat people as ends, not as means. We all desire happiness, and we get that happiness by finding our end, our purpose, in others, not treating others like tools to our happiness. If the framework we live in treats others like stepping stones or tools to our own enjoyment and fulfillment, then we're doing something wrong. But if we see as a source of our joy and fulfillment relationship with others, true community, then there is true flourishing of the soul. There is some real spiritual growth there.
Because even people that I think of themselves as on the right side of stuff can really act like absolute freaks on the internet because they're basically embodying that logic of tech dehumanization, whether they're thinking about it or not. And I'll be honest with you, reading this encyclical did not turn me into a fervent believer. I did not go to mass yesterday.
You're totally invited to, though.
But I think that it's very important that the leader of the largest Christian church in the world says this stuff, because it goes directly at the heart of the technological, financial, and military projects of the West.
In other words, it's doing what consistent moral thought should do.
And while it might be awesome if you could convince your parents to read Marx, they're probably not going to do that, right? But if your parents...
Again, this is an assumption that these values of solidarity, the common good, and human dignity are unique to Marx or leftist thought. They're not. They're not unique to leftist thought by any means. Every civilization that has ever existed, at least on paper, values these things. Self-serving capitalist societies assume that they already have accomplished solidarity, human dignity, and working towards the common good. All right? So telling them that these things are really leftist thoughts, they're just going to stop listening to you because they think we've already got that covered. All right? Everything that is supposedly left-leaning in this document is a logical extension of Catholic social teaching. It has no reference to leftist thought. And that is a point that should be emphasized more. Right? Because we're being unreliable narrators when we force something from a different strain of thought and we hammer it into our own polemical system. Right? It is an unfaithful reading and interpretation of the text. Which means that the problems that are accurately pointed out in Michael Burns's reading of the document then go ignored. Right? Take, for example, the environmental problems of climate change. Right? It's not that, well, you'll find some on the right who believe that it isn't real and it's just a hoax, but you'll find others who see it as a problem that that naturally gets solved. So, again, the damage to our environment is a systematic problem. But by forcing such documents like Laudato Si into our left-right framework, the people who need to hear it the most end up ignoring it. And that's a real problem. So, being more faithful to the text is an important first step. It's a prerequisite to allowing the full implications of Magnifica Humanitas to be understood and shared.
Are Catholic, many are, or even just Christian. This creates an opportunity to talk to them about the project of militarized capitalist dehumanization via...
Yeah, all right. Marx is not the only critique of this problem.
the words of the leader of the Catholic Church, right? Because sometimes if you're like, well, Dad, Marx says, then Dad's just like, ho, 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 ho. But if you're like, you know, the Pope said something interesting, Dad. And, you know, imagine if your dad's Tucker Carlson. You know, if Tucker Carlson's kids, if you're watching this, Tucker's kids, if you're not crazy like your dad, you could read this and then you could be like, hey, Dad, so the Pope said something.
Let's revisit disarming our language. Right? This is what it refers to. Now you could ask, and it would be a fair question, why am I not reacting to a right-winger's interpretation of this document or hammering a text in? Because I don't think most right-wingers are even going to bother reacting to this document or reading it, much less reading it inappropriately. And reading a document, and to quote G.K. Chesterton, anything worth doing is worth doing badly. So it's better to read the document and have a failure to make appropriate distinctions rather than to not read the document at all. So,
something that was a little bit interesting. And a text like this also creates some pressure on the warmongering ghouls of American Christianity to drop the...
again, all right, he's conflating evangelicalism with American Christianity. Just because evangelicals are the most influential Protestant denomination in the United States doesn't mean that they're the equivalent thereof. It doesn't mean they represent Christianity as a whole. There are over 1 billion Catholics throughout the entire world. Right? There may or may not be a billion Protestants. But that's a loaded term, because these groups because the different Protestant groups, dependent on the group, are so distinct, they may as well be whole and completely different religions, both in terms of culture, tradition, and beliefs concerning the nature of God. So again, failure to make appropriate distinctions, while hard, is necessary to get your message across to the people who need to hear it the most.
Act that it's all about God, and instead just acknowledge that they have no interest in peace or justice or solidarity for humanity. They just want to drop bombs and make money and kill kids and get day drunk while filleting the downstairs parts of Silicon Valley sociopaths who haven't actually even read The Lord of the Rings. I too have not read The Lord of the Rings, but did I name my tech company after something from The Lord of the Rings? No, I did not. So I don't have a tech company yet. Soon I will, though. I'm going to do Guns But Woke is going to be my tech company. We're going to make guns, but they're woke guns.
I was going to make a sarcastic comment, but it sounded better in my head.
That probably already exists. Okay, thank you for hanging out. Thank you so much, especially to all of the patrons for keeping this channel afloat. If you're interested in tithing to the congregation, click the link below or go to burnstheory.com. When you do that, you get access to all my videos without ads, my Discord server, regular guest lectures, reading series, other stuff like that. You'll also be among the only people in the world that will have streaming access to my new movie, Leave a Comment, which is sort of about the same things as this Encyclical, but from a less religious angle. Okay, so go in the peace of the Lord and try to do some human shit while you're at it.
That's a nice way to end it. Yeah, do something human. Right. My final thoughts on that. Well, here, let's, since the video is over, let's switch scenes again. Okay. So my final thoughts on this are, it's a good video overall. All right. Michael Burns here is really wrestling with important aspects that the document addresses, namely solidarity. Can't see my finger in the screen, but yeah, solidarity, human dignity, and the common good. These are three very important things to think about seriously. And even if you read even if you don't read the document faithfully, which I don't think he does, it's no fault of his own. Let me just keep popping up. All right. If you don't read the document in its own terms, you can still get the idea that these three things are extremely important. So for a first reading of the document, I think it's a good analysis for a first time reading it. But now comes the challenge. To read it a second, a third, maybe a fourth. Let's draw out its implications. Let's draw out the framework it's written in. It's a very good document, and it's well worth it, in my opinion. It touches on so much more than just what this video was able to talk about, and we'll do more and more work on this very document, Magnifica Humanitas. Right? I think this is probably one of the most important documents in the modern world. Right? It's just as groundbreaking as... Okay, maybe I'm reading too much into it, but I honestly, this is like the modern Magna Carta. Except, Magna Carta was made for British law, and this is made for reminding us how to be people rather than machines. But in terms of importance and impact, it can be more impactful than even the Magna Carta, in my view. But in order to understand that, we're going to need to unpack it some more and draw out all its ideas in the framework in which it was written, namely Catholic social teaching. All right, so yeah, those are my thoughts. Hopefully you'll be here next time for when we take another look at another aspect of Magnifica Humanitas. Thank you. Bye.